Back when I was just a child, the video game arcades of the 1980s held an allure like little else. The flashing lights, vivid colors, sounds, and music that emanated from within were like a siren song to the adolescent mind. I was 8 years old when a brand new cabinet arrived at the Dream Machine, an arcade at my local mall. Kung Fu Master was like nothing I had ever seen before, and I was captivated by the game from the moment I played it for the first time. Designed by Nishiyama Takashi, the game was released by Irem in 1984 as Spartan X in Japan. As far as backstories go, it was pretty standard fare for the time. Thomas, the main character, was attacked and his girlfriend Sylvia abducted. How original. Thomas, a kung fu master, must therefore fight his way through 5 floors of the Devil's Temple and defeat Mr. X in order to get her back. The game was inspired by martial arts movies such as Bruce Lee's Game of Death, from which the multiple floors and boss battle concepts originated. Jackie Chan's Meals on Wheels, uncoincidentally known as Spartan X in Japan, provided the game's title and character names. Considered to be the very first side-scrolling beat-em-up, Kung Fu Master would inspire many games that would come later, from Super Mario Bros. To Street Fighter. You heard that right. It was none other than Miyamoto Shigeru who directed the Nintendo port of Kung Fu, and it was that work that inspired development of the first Super Mario title. Many arcade brawlers would follow in the game's footsteps, but upon its debut, Kung Fu Master would climb to become the second highest grossing arcade game of 1985 in America. It wouldn't be long until home versions flooded the market. The Apple II and Commodore 64 ports arrived a year later in 1985. Both were programmed by Berkeley Softworks and published by Data East. The latter version could be found amongst the top 5 best-selling C64 games of 1986. Being that it was my favorite arcade game of the day, it was only natural that I'd want to play it at home. Now 9 or maybe 10, I didn't have a lot of money, and I'd never even bought a game of my very own before. The only computer at home was the family's Apple IIc, so it was going to be that or nothing. Some of you will remember Toys R Us as it was in the 80s. To a child obsessed with all things electronic, it was a wonderland of sights and sounds, with entire aisles dedicated to home computers and game consoles. Another whole aisle was set aside just for games, floor to ceiling. While the actual software was kept locked in a cage up front, copies of the box art were displayed on hundreds of little plastic flaps. You'd browse the titles until you found the one you wanted and flip it open to reveal a paper card. Taking the card to the cashier, you'd pay and then be able to pick up your purchase at another counter past the checkout. A process, to be sure, but one now permanently etched into my memory on this, the day of my first ever video game purchase. As best as I can tell, the game retailed for about $25 through mail order, give or take. It might have been a little more expensive at brick-and-mortar retailers, but either way, it was a lot of money for a child my age to scrape together from doing household chores and mowing lawns. But it was all going to be worth it, right? How could it not? Look at this box art. The hero is kicking butt while a sorcerer casts some sort of magic spell and a dragon looks on. A dragon! And look at these screenshots. The graphics are amazing. In my excitement, I honestly couldn't tell them apart from the arcade. It was even endorsed by the US National Video Game Team, whatever that was. I could not wait to get home and play. What the fuck? Where are my colorful graphics? Where's the pounding music and the crunch of my foot connecting with an enemy's face? Where's the fast-paced arcade action? Where's the excitement? Oh, I'd been lied to. The innocence of my childhood had been stolen from me. My world had been crushed and life no longer held any meaning. Who would do such a thing? Kung Fu Master for the Apple II is not a good game. Even as a 10-year-old, this was immediately apparent. Putting aside the fact it looked nothing like the screenshots on the box that had enticed me to buy it in the first place, the game simply wasn't any fun to play. Let me call your attention to this option in the menu. As far as I can tell, it does nothing, as the game literally has no sound of any kind, except for brief start and end of level jingles. Fully half the screen is taken up by the scoreboard, but that measure by itself doesn't seem to fix the game's performance issues. It speeds up or slows down depending on the number of enemies on screen. Often, these slowdowns prevent you from throwing any punches or kicks, regardless of how furiously you mash the buttons. The more enemies, the less chance you have to hit any of them, and the more likely they are to mob you. Kung Fu Master? More like Kung Fu Disaster, am I right? Hit detection isn't great either. Sometimes you manage to connect from far away. Other times, you can't land a kick even when you're clearly within striking range. There's a different trick for fighting each of the level bosses. Even when armed with this knowledge, the stiff controls usually mean the fights are over in the blink of an eye. Are we having fun yet? And don't even bother trying to fight the bees. Even if you land a strike and get points for the hit, you often still take a ton of damage. I learned a hard lesson that day. I can still feel the sting, get it? Of that disappointment, even now, almost 40 years later. I will never forget how the elation of coming home with the first game of my very own turned to utter despair. In the future, I would be wiser with how I spent my hard-earned money. In time, I would come to understand that not all ports were created equal. Moreover, not every computer is adept at every genre of game. Karateka on the Apple II is a shining example of a martial arts game done right, with beautiful graphics, fluid animation, and memorable sound and music. It might not be the same type of fast arcade action, but it still makes the most of the system's hardware, and it's the game I should have bought that day instead. But you know what? That was only half the story. Maybe you spotted this earlier, but the game came on a flippy disk with both the Apple II and Commodore 64 versions on different sides. If I never played the game again on the 2C, it'd still be too soon. But I was determined to get my money's worth out of it. You see, the elementary school I attended at the time had a Commodore 64 in the back room of the library. None of the teachers knew how to use it, so there it sat unused. My friends and I would sneak over and play with it in our free time. Scramble, Cave of the Word Wizard, and now, Kung Fu Master. Now this was the experience I had been looking for. This was the arcade at home. Well, not exactly home, not yet. But the Commodore version was everything I had hoped the game would be when I first unboxed it and booted up the family computer that day. Okay, well, maybe it was a little chunkier, but all the elements were there and it was exhilarating to play. That was the important thing. Now, I'm not here to trash the Apple II. There are many great games for the system. This is just not one of them. It's also not fair to directly compare the two platforms either, since the Apple II launched the same year as the Commodore PET. That said, publishers looking to cash in on an arcade sensation could have been a bit more honest, especially given that only a couple years had passed since the great video game crash of 1983. These sorts of shenanigans might just drive a burgeoning game enthusiast to acts of piracy. Not that I would know anything about that. Playing the Commodore version opened my eyes to something I didn't know I'd been missing. The night and day difference in sound and graphics made such an impression on my young mind that it was this game, this single experience alone, that set me down a new path. I would no longer use the family computer for gaming. I had to find a way to buy my own Commodore 64. It had suddenly become the thing I wanted most in the whole world, and I was determined to make it happen. It was because of Kung Fu Master that I sought a job at the local farm when I was 11. A brand new 64C cost $125 through mail order by then. It took time, and it took sweat, dirt, and determination, but I knew it would be worth every second. Surely you can imagine what it felt like the day I was finally able to bring that 64 home. Such a simple thing, but the small act of buying my very own computer set in motion a chain of events that led us all the way to this very moment. I'm sure you've all had a day like this of your own. After all, everyone has their own origin story. This is mine. Before we wrap up, let's take a quick look at a couple of Easter eggs in the game. Did you know that Thomas didn't just rely on his punches and kicks on the Commodore? Pressing Shift and G when facing left on the first level causes him to pull a gun. Somehow we knew about this as kids, but I've long since forgotten how we learned about it. Anyway, I started blasting. If you don't immediately move after shooting, you'll see a message pop up showing the name Chris Hawley, who is credited as the programmer of this port. On the Apple version there's no gun, but an Easter egg appears when you press Ctrl-J during gameplay. This secret screen might have the best graphics in the entire game. It credits Aaron M. and Donna S. for the art, as well as Clayton Jung and Mike Farr, ostensibly for the code. Hitting Ctrl-F will return you back to the game. Finally, let me call your attention to the game manual. Here, in the Getting Started section, notice that it says to insert your Karate Champ disc. The error appears a second time under the Apple II section as well. I guess Data East must have copy-pasted that section from the earlier title and then forgotten to update it. A few years after I bought that first 64, I ended up selling my entire Commodore collection to a gentleman in Canada in order to pay for my first 386 PC. In order to make this video in 2023, I reacquired the game from a seller on eBay, also in Canada. I know it's highly improbable, but part of me likes to believe that there's a chance this game is actually my original copy finally come home. As early as I can remember, I was always fascinated by computers and video games. But it was the purchase of my very own Commodore 64 that really set me down the path I would follow for the rest of my life. Tinkering, upgrades, user groups starting a BBS, engineering school, a career in IT, and ultimately, even this YouTube channel. All thanks to Kung Fu Master and its terrible Apple II port. I hope you enjoyed this bit. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Retro Bits.